Chapter 4, The Loin of the Beast. When I was growing up in South Dakota, I had a reoccurring nightmare. It stemmed from the fact that I went from a brand new house in the city of Sioux Falls to an old farmhouse out in the country. This old farmhouse had a root cellar instead of a cement basement. It didn't even have stairs. To access the basement, you had to go outside and open the heavy door, which revealed a staircase covered in webs. Creepy. The dirt floor smelled old, and the stone foundation that mirrored the rooms above it had a peculiar feature: a hole. This broken or unfinished wall was right out of Edgar Allan Poe's Cask of Amontillado. As a child, I'd peer into the darkness and expect a vampire or mummy to come crawling out. So, it fueled my nightmare. The nightmare manifested itself into my belief that some immortal, undead creature lived in my basement, and that the builders of the house had somehow unearthed it from its slumber. Have you read my fiction series? Since this is a grown-up Bible study, and I likely lost credulity by bringing up a DNA Frankenstein Antichrist, I'm not going to get into all the fun stuff I found in the rabbit hole. But there was significant stories about ancient kings. And many of those obvious secret society organizations connect to ancient symbolism about an ancient, beheaded king. So when it comes to dead kings from antiquity, I have quite a bit of imagination. Let's roll up our sleeves and take a look. Surprisingly, we didn't have a huge list of villains to evaluate. Granted, the timeline is a pretty narrow 4 millennia of choices, since we don't hear or care about anything other than Middle East history. Beyond that, we're looking for a reference in the Bible. So, here's the list I quickly came up with. Cain. His evil traits: being a first murderer. His eliminating factor: not a king. Lamech, whose evil traits were being a murderer and a polygamist. His eliminating factor: I don't know if he was a king. Ham. His evil traits: he was a mean son. And his eliminating factor: he was one of the 8 saved by the ark. So I don't know if it's him. Next one, Nimrod. His evil traits: incest and magic. And eliminating factor: Next one, Abraham's Pharaoh. His evil traits: being horny. His eliminating factor: the dude was kind. He still let Abraham and his wife in. The next one we have, Chedorlaomer. Lots of vowels. His evil trait: he was a warrior king. But his eliminating factor: he was an ally of Abraham, so thus a good guy. The next evil guy I came across, Esau. And his evil trait, of course, being hungry. And his eliminating factor: he wasn't a king. But speaking of kings, we've got a few Egyptian kings. Joseph's Pharaoh, for example. His evil characteristic was supporting slavery, but he went and also saved Israel. The next one we have, the infanticide Pharaoh. His evil characteristic, of course, was post-term abortion, aka killing babies. Moses' Pharaoh had a hard heart. Now, a little bit later, we have the mysterious Amalek, whose evil characteristics were blood-licking. And, of course, he was not necessarily human. You get some other kind of folklorish kind of figures. Balaam or Balak were defeated soundly. Nothing too intimidating with them. You have a couple strange ones, Enoch or Og. I mean, their characteristic: they were giants, but were they technically humans? Same thing goes for Goliath. While he was definitely big, he wasn't human and he wasn't a king. But speaking of kings, you get a couple others. King Agag, nothing. The king of Tyre, however, I mean, he was possessed by Satan, perhaps. So he was interesting. Ben-Hadad of Syria, nothing. Sennacherib, I mean, he was the one who defeated the northern tribes, but then nothing. Pharaoh Necho, the time of Josiah, He certainly was ambitious, but then nothing else. And finally, we had Nebuchadnezzar, who definitely enslaved Judea, but unfortunately, he repented and got down on his knees and praised God. Now, did I miss somebody else? Who knows? These guys are what I'm left to deal with. Remember, I'm searching for the top 3 Sons of Perdition candidates, and while being evil is important, I'm also looking for willful enemies of God. Cain, for example, is notorious for being the first murderer, but that was because of jealousy. He still made sacrifices to God. Esau, likewise, is a bad brother, but nowhere near an evil despot. Plus, not kings. When I looked at all these names, the most obviously wicked king would have been a pharaoh from Exodus. Now, killing infants is a terrible policy, but I chose the hard-hearted pharaoh since he willfully rejected God and the Egyptian gods in favor of his secret worship of Baal and Anath. His priests also defied God with their own snake trick. He'll be chapter 6. While with a little research, I learned that the Tower of Babel guy not only had a funny name, Nimrod, but also had a ton of legends and lore about his wickedness. When you realize the purpose for building the tower, his wickedness became more obvious than Ramses the Great. He'll be chapter 5. So what about chapter 4? This chapter? If I were forced to rank a third king, I might have been rushed to include Sennacherib or Nebuchadnezzar because of what they did to Israel. I also might have picked one of these guys associated with giants because of how much God despises those abominations. A significant thought entered my mind. The end times will be like the days of Noah. Thus, if those days were so bad, perhaps I should look closer at the early days. Initially, I was a bit disappointed by the lack of details. Here's a summary of the entire pre-flood world. Genesis 1, the days of creation. Genesis 2, life in the garden. Genesis 3, the fall. Genesis 4, Cain and Abel and some Cain stuff. Genesis 5, the descendants of Adam. Genesis 6, we got some wickedness, the Nephilim, and the building of the ark. But by Genesis 7, we have the flood. And by Genesis 8, we already have the new world. See? Not much there. However, I believe I found the story within Genesis. Right after Cain murdered Abel, and he went to live in the land of Nod. There is a time lapse. While we can't be for certain how much time passes between day 6 and the fall, it's equally challenging to imagine the timeline of Cain and Abel. We do get the lifespans in Genesis 5 to match, but we don't get much of an answer for where Cain's wife comes from or why he needed a mark if there's only 2 to 3 people on Earth. Speculate those answers. Yet, hiding in Genesis 4 are some curious moments. Big picture? Genesis is a summary given to Moses from God while hanging out in the fiery tent during the Exodus. It had been almost 1,000 years since the flood, according to the Genesis timeline. And God selected only the most important details to give the Hebrews. So why did God bring up Lamech? A clue. Let's take a closer look at Cain first. So this is from Genesis 4:10. And the Lord said, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me unto the ground. And now thou art cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hands. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be on earth." And Cain said unto the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out from this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face I shall be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one who finds me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, Therefore, whoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any one finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. Now, being a vagabond and fugitive seems to suggest that Cain could not find rest. He became a lone wolf. Strangely, his concern is that he'll get killed in retribution. By whom? Strange. He doesn't express worry about mom or dad. He mentions everyone will hate him because of this deed. And if they find him, they'll kill him in retribution. Huh? Who? I guess if Moses didn't need details, neither do we. The mark of Cain has received endless speculation, but in a nutshell, he gets a physical change. It is a visual identifier so that everyone who encounters him can tell him apart. This isn't a scarlet letter of shame, mind you. This is a don't kill this guy or it'll be worse for you visual warning. I mean, very strange. I've read theories about it being a racial mark all the way to being the creation of werewolves. I mean, gingers, the mark of Cain. Africans, the mark of Cain. Epilepsy, the mark of Cain. Crooked teeth, the mark of Cain. Neanderthals, well, that's the mark of Cain. Blonde hair and blue eyes, the mark of Cain. So, the mark is a speculative mess. However, I did find it interesting that whatever God did to Cain, it also came with geographic isolation. He walked away from the Eden region and went to the land of wandering, Nod. Even if the mark had nothing to do with genetic identity, 1,000 years of genetic isolation would further separate the appearance of these two population groups. So let's follow the continued story of Cain, 4:17. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bare Enoch. And he builded a city, and and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehujael, and Mehujael begat Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech. And here it gets interesting. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the other name of the other Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and such as have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artifice in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Neba. And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, Hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Who was Mrs. Cain? Genesis doesn't explain. The Ethiopians and other cultures have names for the daughters of Adam, who were the mismatched twins of Cain and Abel. Speculation allows for Eve to give birth to a child on a yearly basis, right? And if she lived approximately the same lifespan as Adam, she holds the potential to give birth to hundreds of children from age 20 to 200. Sarah, Elizabeth, right? Eve has a perfect uterus and a 900-year-old lifespan. I mean, ponder that. So speculation allows that Cain could have wandered the earth for a century and come back to grab a wife from among the 100 or more daughters of Eve. But I'm going to drop this issue now. A city. Ooh, that's interesting. In contrast to the peaceful agrarian Sethites, the Cainites live in fear. And when you live in fear, you need protection from scary things. So what scared them? I mean, Without clarification of reproduction habits, the speculative population boom could have been impressive. Cain could have 1,000 grandkids running around. I mean, who knows? Obviously, you need at least a handful to qualify as a city. There's also a paradox between the wandering Cain and the Cain who built the city. Is he like a long-distance trucker who goes out into the world for long stretches at a time? Again, who knows? A few generations later, we get Lamech. Now, there are only a few strange verses to study, but you have to ask yourself, why did God even bother giving them to Moses? Why bring up Lamech? In the most literal interpretation, the flood wipes out everybody but 8 humans. Following Cain's exile, God could have ignored the rest, and the Kennedys lived happily ever after, Yet God went out of his way to slow things down to remind those Hebrews all about Lamech. There must be a reason to do this when the lesson is so strange. So let's look at the clues from the text. Characteristic A frisky fella. Okay, boring stuff first. A few generations passed. Now, remember, these generations are much, much, much different than the generations of Moses, who maxed out his lifespan at 120 years. When aligning the pre-flood generations, you have the possibility that the generations overlapped with each other. You'd live long enough to see your great-great-great-grandchild. That's weird. Now, the heirs of Seth lived righteous lives, and they waited years past puberty to start having kids during the self-control of their 2nd century life. Assuming that Cain had no self-control, the descendants of Cain are spreading like wildfire and would quickly outnumber the Sethites. So not only would they get started early, but they would pop out a new child yearly. The city would be full and then some. Along with the possibility of wild child production, notice that Cain is a polygamist. I know. Now, sorry, I'm not trying to make light of that, but Abraham, he had Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah. Moses, Aaron and Miriam clear their throats. Zipporah and Tharbus, folks didn't know about her, did they? King Solomon, do 300 concubines even count? Well, it doesn't matter. It lists 700 official wives. I'm not trying to diminish marriage here, but the Old Testament hadn't quite established this as a huge deal. Put on your tinfoil hat for Adam, and you can even see 3 women, Eve, woman, and even whispers of another called Lilith. Yes, bringing up a famous polygamist might have been used to shame Moses and the Hebrews into a traditional marriage system. Lamech certainly could have had loose morals, which accounted for him marrying Ada and Zillah. Perhaps there was a strong moral code that's not explicitly stated in Genesis. Cain chose incest, while Seth chose poof, a magically appearing non-relative. Why not? We just don't get those details. My point is that sexual immorality is not the make or break characteristic to separate sheep from goats. Abraham, Jacob, David, see what I mean about sexual immorality. But what's in a name? Since we know so little about this time period, let's look a bit closer at the meaning behind the names to try to gain some clarity. The name Lamech often means powerful. This leads me to think of the Conan the Barbarian type who becomes king because he's the biggest, baddest alpha male in the pack. There are some variations of Lamech that bring in a low connotation, which does have connection to the perdition concept. The word perdition comes from the word apoloye, polemy, which means cut off, destruction, severed. The root also reminds me of Apollyon, the destroyer, and Belial, who is described as the vile, worthless, never to rise one. So, low and never to rise. The name Lamech has some wicked possibilities. Now, on a side note, 20 years ago at least, I found an article about this name. In it, the writer connected the Old Hebrew to the term Amalek from Exodus. He proposed a Harry Potter-esque, he who shall not be named, kind of cursed name. In this same crazy article, he mentioned that the local Arabians who worshipped Amalek used the word Merrick also. And who's Merrick? Well, that is the loin of the beast in the Big Dipper constellation. And how many stars does the Big Dipper have? 7. And what do the pole stars lead to? An 8th. I feverishly jotted this stuff down in my notebook, later to use it in my novels. But now, I can't find a trace of the article. I mean, it was cool, but you can't always trust what you read on the internet. Ada is a far less nefarious name. Her name means ornament. She's pretty. Zilla's name means shadow. Huh? Oh boy, so many options here. I mean, racially, it could mean a genetic separation has already begun. Meh. Or, more fantastical, it could mean she's related to that Hebrew legend of Lilith, and she's some witchy woman. Or, it could reflect her personality, and she's the gothy Stevie Nicks queen. The boys, Jabal means leader or stream. Okay. Jubal means lead or a stream. Now, Tubal-Cain, for some reason, kind of means the same thing. He's a leader or leading. I mean, Yod. However, Naamah. Her name means beautiful or pleasure, which is very boom chicka wow wow, yet gives us little else. I'll tell you one thing. There are some myths and legends about her. Just like it was odd for Lamech to even get a mention, it's even odder that Naamah would get a mention 1,000 years after she existed. I mean, who cares about the geography before the flood? I mean, who cares about a city being destroyed by the world flood? Well, God felt it was important to mention Naamah. And the legends and lore? I mean, Naamah was one of 4 women on the ark. The Hebrew Midrash goes as far as to suggest she was a singer and the wife of Noah. There it is. Now, I found a dozen names for Noah's wife from dozens of mythologies. Yet, Naamah shows up in several contexts involving the ark. It's curious. It seems as if the blood of Cain likely found its way through the flood. The fathers of. As a fan of world mythology, the 3 brothers construct is used again and again and again. I mean, heck, Seth, Cain, Abel. In many of these same legends, the 3 brothers represent distinct styles and differences. Lamech's boys seem to follow suit. Realism. For the realist, the boys represent different nations, and ignoring the global aspects of the flood, they show the originals of the other people in the world. Considering the time period, it seems to summarize the development of humanity. We developed instruments and music. We learned metallurgy. We learned how to farm. Anthropologically, this could be a 10,000 or 100,000 year summary of Homo sapien development. Fantasy. Or the mark of Cain doomed these guys to subhuman groups. I mean, there are the light elves, which have associations with music. The dark elves, I mean, if tents equal darkness, maybe. And dwarves, the metals. I mean, these are the monsters that prey upon regular humans. In Norse mythology, we have the Aesir and the Vanir separated into separate global regions. And the Vanir represented this stained dark race. It's just a thought. Now, literal. It doesn't matter because the flood swept them all away. I mean, except for the Lamech incident, everything that breathed air died in the flood. So these three nations have a dead end, right? I mean, God mentions them to Noah to help understand the wickedness of the people. In other words, they weren't normal folks like Egyptians, Hebrews, and Ethiopians. They were the offspring of the mark. Characteristic B, a murderer. By itself, this chapter of Genesis doesn't paint a very vivid picture, but once you do a little digging, you realize there is a ton of mythology about this story. Old legends. First, let's look at what it says in Genesis. I have slain a man. Well, that's pretty clear. Lamech killed somebody. He didn't even hide the fact. He gathered his wives and told them so. Yet he suddenly adds another detail. And a young man. No, hold on. 2 Lamech? Now it's getting serious. Notice how there is no mention or reference to war or battle. This seems to be murder. Our Lamech is a serial killer? The psychology here is interesting. The cops didn't come in and knock on his door. Lamech seems to purposely reveal to his wives that he's done this. Why? The wives learn their husband is a killer. Is it to intimidate? Show off? Brag? These murders are referenced as if it is in the past, so he's committed them without consequence. The old legends I mentioned earlier surround the Song of the Sword. This is quite a rabbit hole. For some, it is the title of this ancient poem describing Lamech. For others, it is the backstory that Genesis references. In the backstories, the details vary a bit, but the central detail is that Lamech was out hunting one day when he came across some sort of wild man beast. He followed. He acted. He killed. Oops, it turned out to be Cain. In the accidental killing of Cain, Lamech is overcome, and upon clapping his mighty hands together, he accidentally also kills his son, Tubal-Cain. It goes something like that. Characteristic C, blasphemy. Regardless of the 2 slain figures, the reaction from Lamech is what's so worthy to note. Yes, he brags and flexes, but notice where his mind goes. Mocking. He brings up that Cain was cursed by God. Well, the mark meant that anyone who hurt Cain would be cursed 7-fold. Apparently, Lamech bore this curse since he killed Cain. Cain is the first man he killed. Then he killed his own son, which in his mind was even worse. So he reasons that his wickedness and curse will be 77-fold. When Cain killed Abel, God showed up. When Lamech killed Cain, that's Lamech's point. There is no God. Nothing happened to him. He killed a man, and there was no divine judgment. He got away with it. Whether in the same moment or much later, he killed a second person. Nothing happened to him. So later, he calls his wives together to tell them what happened. He survived touching the hot stove, and he wasn't even burned. So why include this in Genesis? God's short version of history still includes Lamech while introducing the flood. As much as the sons of God and the giants likely change the game, the story of Lamech is equally important. This guy was wicked, and by allowing his sin to go unpunished, it seemingly grew. The result? The world was filled with violence, and they also turned their hearts from God. Lamech is the poster child for the pre-flood world. In Antichrist, the biggest problem with planting my flag upon the hill of Lamech is the literal destructive quality of the described flood. Modern scientists scoff at the details of the flood because that much water would simply not allow anything to survive. The humidity alone would make it impossible to breathe. The tidal forces created by the moon would scour the earth with each daily pass. Plugging the details of Genesis into the computer creates absurd levels of destruction. It'd take a miracle to survive it in an ark. It also makes it problematic to find the kingdom of Lamech, or Lamech himself. My interpretation of Mr. 8 is that he's a genetic Frankenstein of the 7 kings that came before him. By picking Lamech as king number 1, I'm basically painting myself into a corner. How do you get genetic code from someone from before the flood? Creation scientists have no problems explaining what happened to the dinosaurs prior and during the flood, yet burying Lamech in a tomb that managed to survive the flood requires quite a bit of imagination and a whole lot of magic and chance. My greatest ally in choosing Lamech are the heaps of mythology in the world that not only describe a flood and a wicked world, but in many cases describe an evil figure who gets buried by the flood. I'll serve up an easy one. Norse mythology. Ragnarok is a great parallel to an era of fallen angels and giants, where a global disaster comes and cleanses the world. It has a couple of human survivors saved inside of a tree, but it also mentions that not all the gods and giants perished during the flood. Some of them survived, only to be buried alive. That's the type of story that prehistoric tribes were telling around the campfire. Buried God stories spread over the world. The days of Noah. Lastly, I feel that God loves symbolism and foreshadowing too much for him not to pick someone from the world before the flood. Genesis and Revelation are the 2 bookends of our human story, so ignoring this era would be a bit disappointing. If King Agag was one of the 7, I'd be very disappointed. But Lamech, dude, he's pretty epic. And imagination allows his evil kingdom in the land of Nod to be a major factor in the reasons we got a flood. However, I didn't settle on Lamech until I'd done my research into King Nimrod. Nimrod led me to my truth about the head theory. Buckle up. Let's meet Nimrod.